Hey guys, what's happening? Well, Babylon's U.S. strikes the Caribbean really hard, and if a lot of you think that perilous times are coming, well, they're already here. So maybe it's time a lot of us wake up. This guy on the screen right here, Marco Rubio, he did something 4 years ago, and he's back at it again. 4 years ago, he talked about Cuba. I want you to stick around because this is affecting all of us. This
Senators
is
Rick
what he
Scott
did
and
4 years
Marco
ago.
Rubio today introduced a bill to stop the flow of money to the Cuban regime. The Cut Profits to the Cuban Regime Act would require the State Department to publish the list of countries that contract with the Cuban government for its controversial medical missions program.
Of course, Cuba is under decades and decades of embargo by the United States regime.
The
This is
U.S. is
today now.
expanding
Listen
a
to this.
Cuban visa restriction policy. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said it will target what he called forced labor linked to the Cuban labor export program.
So it's Marco Rubio, same guy at it again, 4 years after. So he's not stopping. And the latest is that what is happening is that they're now telling Caribbean leaders, look, if you don't stop this nonsense of having Cuban doctors in your territory, we'll take away the visas. Now, this is bullying of the highest order. But the United States, has that's the official narrative of why the United States has sought to end Cuba's medical missions because they say it's exploitive, and they're saying that they're making money from exploiting people. Take you down the rabbit hole because for decades, Cuba's international medical missions have been a symbol of soft power. That's right. And their international medical brigades have sent thousands of doctors to countries where in Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, you know them, and they were offering free health care to populations in need. But here's where it gets interesting. Cuba's healthcare system is often praised for its effectiveness despite the island's poverty and economic isolation. In fact, Cuba has trained so many doctors and health professionals that it has become a global leader in medical diplomacy. Do you think that the United States would want this after pressuring Cuba for so long? Hmm? Do you think that they would want that? It shows them up that that their pressuring of Cuba is not working, and that is the problem. Now enter the United States. At face value, the US government portrays Cuba's medical missions as what? Form of political manipulation. They say it's a tool to expand Cuba's influence under the guise of humanitarianism. They argue that Cuba uses these missions to spread its ideological agenda, furthering socialist narratives in countries that may be vulnerable to influence, particularly those in where? In the Caribbean and Latin America. But the truth is, Cuba's medical missions are doing something much more disruptive to US interests than just promoting an ideology. So let's break it down, and I'll tell you why the US is really getting upset and why they're pissed off so much. Medical diplomacy versus pharmaceutical profits. You get the picture now? One of the reasons the US has long sought to sabotage Cuba's medical efforts is that it undermines the pharmaceutical industrial complex. Now you figure out. Now you're getting it. Imagine a scenario where Cuba, small nation, is providing free medical care and treatment to countries that could otherwise be spending billions of dollars on Western pharmaceutical companies. You see, the US is heavily invested in the global pharmaceutical market, with companies that reap enormous profits from selling drugs, medical equipment, and treatments in developing nations. Cuba's approach is a direct threat to this model, not just because it offers healthcare at no cost, but because it also offers a more effective one in many cases. Cuba focus on what? What do they focus on? Preventative care, health education, and community-based treatment. It's radically different from the capitalist approach of treating illness with what you call high cost pharmaceuticals and hospital care. So the US cannot afford to have other nations see that there's an alternative way to deliver healthcare, one that does not involve lining the pockets of big farmers. People all the way from Germany, Italy, all over the world from China head to Cuba, you know. That's right. If you didn't know that, now you know. But Babylon, US, is striking the Caribbean hard. And then we go to the other topic of political leverage and independence. You see, Cuba's medical missions are often deployed in countries that have long standing political and economic ties with the US. For instance, in the Caribbean nations like you would say Jamaica and when they say Haiti, and even some in Central America have been identified, and they have benefited from Cuba's healthcare services. In fact, places like St. Vincent have benefited greatly. Cuba has been accused of gaining political leverage through these missions, as they offer nations what you call an alternative to the US. Now, for the US, this poses a threat, not just to its global reach, but to its dominance in the Western Hemisphere. You see, if Cuba can act as the provider of vital services in these regions, it weakens America's soft power and make these nations more independent. And that is exactly what is happening. And the more America tries to drive a wedge between these islands and Cuba, who comes in? Their arch enemy Cuba, their arch enemy Russia. So they're doing more harm than good. Now, here's another layer because while the US has been caught up in geopolitics, Cuba has quietly been making remarkable strides in medical research and innovation. So the island nation has developed several pioneering treatments, particularly in the field of cancer and, vaccines. In fact, Cuba has created its own vax for lung cancer, and one that the US medical establishment has been slow to acknowledge. Well, they're not going to embrace it. So this means that Cuba is not just sending doctors to treat people, but it also is contributing innovative solutions to medical problems. And the US is either unwilling or unable to address on a global scale this issue. And so they're getting upset. Remember, I'm pointing out to you what is going on with America. It's medical diplomacy versus pharmaceutical profits. It's political leverage and independence for the Caribbean countries. It's Cuba's medical advances. And I move on to say aiding the US enemies. Now, let's not forget Cuba's global allies, because nations like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia have been beneficiaries of Cuban medical missions, and these countries are the US adversaries, or they're considered to be the US adversaries. At least America considers them to be adversaries. And the US doesn't just see Cuba's medical missions as charitable, it sees them as a political weapon. They wait for Cuba to maintain and strengthen relationships with regimes that the US seeks to isolate. So when Cuba sends doctors to Venezuela, for example, it's not just about healthcare. It's about keeping that nation in Cuba's orbit away from the US influence. That's what the Americans are saying and they're thinking. And if Cuba's influence in the region grows, so does its ability to disrupt the US policy. So even Cuba, from its weakened position, is disrupting the US global policy. And America has been on and out for decades in taking apart this diplomacy. And then there's what you call global public opinion. Cuba's medical missions are also an image problem for the US. So on the international stage, Cuba is seen as a beacon of altruism, providing free quality health care to undeserved populations around the world, while the US is often criticized for its profit healthcare system. So if the US allowed Cuba's medical diplomacy to continue flourishing, it could erode global support for America's policy in Latin America and the Caribbean, which it already has. And so the humanitarian image of Cuba's medical brigades stands in stark contrast to the US often criticized foreign interventions and sanctions. Somebody always said that the narrative of Cuba as a hero is a dangerous one for the US interest. As a matter of fact, somebody says Cuba sends doctors and America sends sanctions. That's something that someone said to me. So In the end, what it is a symbol of defiance, and America does not like that. Finally, at its core, if you look at it, Cuba's medical missions are a symbol of defiance for years. And the US has imposed sanctions on Cuba, isolating the island and trying to starve its economy. And yet, despite these crippling economic conditions, Cuba has managed to create an effective healthcare system and not only survives and thrives in the face of adversity. The US cannot have this. It's a small socialist island outdoing one of the wealthiest nations in the world in such a vital, universally respected field. It's a challenge to the very notion of what a superpower is. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? That is what the problem is. So when we look at the US efforts to limit Cuba's medical missions, it's not just about political ideology or geopolitics. It's about economic interests, maintaining global influence, protecting the power structures that benefit the US, and controlling who gets to offer solution to the world's problems. In essence, what I'm saying to you is that the US doesn't want Cuba to set a precedent that challenges its control over healthcare, pharmaceutical industries, and soft power in the Western Hemisphere. Well, Rubio and others better get their act together because they've already lost the battle in this Western Hemisphere. And if I know the Caribbean leaders, they're hoping to have dialogue with the US, but I can tell you something. They will not back down, and they will not, for 1 minute, regret losing visas to save lives. So, Rubio, you have a lot of things on your hand, but we'll continue with Babylon US in another episode. So stay tuned for that, okay?